Now we're going to have Louise from Omdia. She's going to come on and talk to us about the games business during and after COVID-19. So I always love the fact when we get people like Louise coming on, we get to get a little bit of an insight from people who look at the data. So Louise, over to you.
Hi.
Hi, how you doing?
Can you hear me okay? Great, awesome. I'm really good, thank you. So yeah, today I'm going to be talking about COVID-19 and the games business with a bit of a focus on mobile, of course. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So just a little bit about me and Omdia, which is the company I work for. So Omdia is a data and research arm of Informa Tech. We're more than 400 analysts and we track the global media and technology markets. Informa Tech also has a really large media and events business, which includes GDC, Gamma Sutra, XRDC, and Black Hat. So in terms of our games research specifically, we've been tracking the games market for over 20 years, so since the 90s. We provide industry players with tactical data and insight, and a really granular understanding of the games landscape in terms of market sizing. So I specialize in mobile games and also PC. Before I became an analyst, I worked in online business development at Square Enix here in London. And prior to that, I was a researcher studying informal learning in online games. So I've got quite a lot to get through, so I'm just going to get started. So first, a brief look at the position and the role of the games industry during the coronavirus pandemic. So what we've seen more broadly in recent times is that the games segment is very robust when it comes to socio-economic shudders. It normally manages to emerge relatively unscathed from these kinds of events. And there are a number of reasons for this. So games are engaging and abundant. There are countless games out there to choose from. They are very cost effective in terms of price per hour consumption. And this really makes them a logical medium for consumers to return to either when they're bored or if they have a lot of time on their hands. Games are also very easy to access. This is especially true now given the rise of mobile gaming. So virtually everyone has a smartphone and this keeps the barrier to entry very low. Games can be accessed literally wherever you are. There's also a lot of variety in games, not unlike TV and cinema. So games provide a huge number of experiences for people from all demographics to enjoy. More games are now adding social layers, which is something which is particularly important during this time, I think. And the addition of these social layers means that games can address people's needs to stay connected when they are geographically dispersed, as many people are now. And this also makes them a lot more appealing to so-called non-gamers, which is a theme that's going to come up quite a bit in this presentation. Finally, games can now be incredibly low cost. So free-to-play titles represent the majority of the market on mobile. And although we haven't really seen this kind of disruption on other platforms, or at least not to this extent, this again lowers the entry barrier. So games are always within reach. But because of this situation we've been facing over the past few months, the manner in which games companies function may already have changed quite fundamentally. So major companies have been, and I'm sure will continue to be expected to provide multiple channels of support to the games landscape. And this is in addition to dealing with their own internal challenges. And this support applies to consumers, so things like smooth maintenance of services under this newly heavy load, and also free content to maximize on the increased number of people that are now looking for something to play. It also applies to enterprise, so we've seen things like tech sharing schemes and subsidies to support the most affected creators. What I think is a really good example of a consumer-facing initiative was Microsoft making Minecraft education temporarily free. And also the Polish government has made use of Minecraft, so they provided a free public server to allow children to interact during lockdown. So really what we're seeing here is games being used as vehicles for remote support by all manner of other segments, from governments to education bodies. So obviously many aspects of game development and publishing can continue to exist even during lockdowns like we're going through at the moment, but scale and interdependency are issues that can cause delays, especially for AAA titles. So numerous facets of the business can pivot towards networked remote working setups. And many of the challenges that they face in these scenarios actually come from things like the extra burdens put on existing infrastructure. So for instance, even dev teams that have really good, solid home working setups may run into significant problems if their home broadband isn't up to scratch, for example. But on the plus side for smaller developers, a lot of big companies have been putting their formal marketing plans on hold. And this has made room for these companies to gain visibility by making some of their content temporarily free. Now I'm going to look at a few kind of broader trends that we've seen in the mobile games market in the last few months. There's been a broad reduction in the games-related acquisitions and funding rounds in the first quarter of this year. And this was largely fueled by declining activity in China. But the coronavirus pandemic has definitely had somewhat of a role in this. But despite this, the actual mobile game segment remained quite strong, and it represented the majority of deals that we saw. And this really underlines the state of the global games market as mobile first now. We've seen Tencent further decelerating its games industry investment. So in 2019, Tencent engaged in only 9 games-related deals. And this trend has continued into the first half of this year. And again, this is something that has been exacerbated by conditions surrounding the pandemic. So Tencent has actually refocused its acquisition and funding activity on industrial internet markets, things like 5G, AI, and also cloud. And these are areas that have been highlighted for growth by the Chinese government. So compared with its domestic competitors like Alibaba and Baidu, Tencent is actually falling behind in the cloud and AI markets. And so I think we can expect to see Tencent's M&A activities in these sectors intensifying, whilst its activity in the games market remains more muted. Something else we're seeing is an increased focus on internal expansion rather than acquisition activity. And ByteDance is a really good example of this. And it presents a lower risk in an unstable economic environment like we're currently in. So we're expecting the COVID-19 outbreak to generate an additional 2 to 3% in annual revenue growth for the mobile games market. This balances greater growth in markets like China with the more modest increases that we see in Western territories. So mobile will be the least affected game segment. This chart actually shows Q1, and it's worth noting that in Q1, the virus had a very limited impact in many mobile first markets, places like South Korea, Japan, and also India. So in territories where mobile is the primary platform of choice for games consumption, user activity will increase even more. But in markets like North America and Europe, where playtime is more evenly split between screens and devices, we're seeing a greater share of this extra recreational time being spent on fixed site platforms. So a lot of these players are actually turning to PC and console. And this has been evidenced by Steam's consecutive record concurrent player counts, and also industry decisions by Sony and Microsoft to limit download speeds on their consoles. In China specifically, publishers of some of the biggest games increased the frequency of their updates in the first quarter, and this resulted in several peaks of user activity for top games like Honor of Kings and Peacekeeper Elite. We also saw Tencent enhance social features for its poker game, and this prompted a huge upsurge in popularity, and it actually turned out that they needed to introduce extra servers to cope with this increase in demand. So as with PC online games in China, mobile should also prepare for a potentially sharp user decline after the pandemic recedes. And I think many publishers will start to introduce less demanding gameplay elements in order to retain these new users that they've acquired through the pandemic. So Omdia data shows that in-app ads account for around 40% of mobile games revenue, with end user spend taking a majority share. So innovation around ad formats, things like rewarded video, interactive and playable ads, and even augmented reality ads will continue to grow in significance and also popularity over the next few years. The COVID-19 pandemic has seen a lot of brands freeze or even cut their advertising budgets. And this will, of course, have a knock-on effect on in-game advertising revenue. Advertisers are also really vulnerable to ad and bot fraud, which threaten to erode advertiser trust in things like measurement and viewability. But during lockdown, many publishers are, of course, trying to expose more people to their titles. So they will likely continue to spend on app install campaigns, particularly because this is a really key revenue stream of in-game advertising. So ultimately, advertising will remain, has remained and will continue to remain important throughout the crisis, because many consumers will still be looking for free content to consume. And now I'm going to cover content trends, so I'm going to focus on a few key titles and genres. In April, Animal Crossing Pocket Camp saw its best month for global downloads since its launch 3 years ago in 2017, and it peaked at over 5 million. So this was primarily driven by two factors, the first one being the lockdown measures, and the second one being the release of the Switch title New Horizons in March. So there was a lot of hype circulating on social media in the lead up to the launch of the Switch game, and this led many people to download the mobile title while they were waiting for the launch of the Switch game. Also, people who didn't own a Switch, or maybe they didn't have the means or the desire to buy one, could kind of tap into this global frenzy through downloading Pocket Camp and playing the mobile title. Also, and importantly, coronavirus-related global Switch shortages may also have led players to instead try out the mobile game. There was a significant increase in New Horizons TV advertisements in March, and this, combined with widespread school closures in key territories like North America and also Western Europe, will have also contributed to increased interest around the Animal Crossing IP. And although downloads have increased quite substantially, the impact on revenue hasn't been quite as significant. So net revenue only grew by 3% in April, despite an almost 100% increase in downloads. And this really reflects a broader trend around mobile games during COVID-19. So more and more users are coming to the platform because they're seeking free content, but generally, these users are not overly familiar with the space or the business or the monetization models, and so they're reluctant to spend. And I think Pocket Camp is actually quite aggressively monetized through in-app purchases, and it also has an optional in-game subscription with 2 tiers that was introduced last year. And this undoubtedly was also quite off-putting to users who are new to the platform. COVID-19 obviously represents a huge threat to location-based augmented reality titles. And what's noticeable in this chart immediately, I think, is Dragon Quest Walk's considerable decline in net revenue. But actually, this can't be attributed to COVID-19 as the game is confined to Japan. So in the first quarter of this year, a large-scale outbreak had yet to occur in Japan. The impact of coronavirus was still very minimal there. So this decay that we're seeing is therefore due to other factors. So Q1 tends to see a broad decline in revenue and engagement in Japan versus Q4, which sees very high seasonal spend. And also the game was only released in the fourth quarter of last year, so it hasn't actually been around that long. And user activity immediately post-launch tends to reach a peak that can't easily be reclaimed in later months. So augmented reality titles only account for around 3% of revenue in the global mobile games market. So this is still a very small amount. Pokémon Go has thrived during lockdown. It hit peak monthly active users for the year so far in March at almost 17 million. And towards the end of March, Niantic announced changes to all of its location-based augmented reality games, including Pokémon Go, but also Wizards Unite. And these changes would make the games a lot easier to play from home. So the USA and Japan are the most substantial markets for Pokémon Go, with the combined territories accounting for around 65% of App Store net revenue in the first quarter of this year. The virus only really started gaining traction in these countries much later in the quarter, and as a result, the measures taken to assist at-home play are likely to offset any notable decline that we see through the second quarter. And this really underlines the importance of being flexible and responsive as a developer or a publisher, because in introducing these measures, Niantic has effectively avoided what could have been a very heavy decline. The board game app genre saw higher growth in downloads than any other mobile games category in April at 29%. So globally, people are turning to these apps as a way of connecting with friends and family during lockdown when it's not possible to play physical board games anymore. And actually, board game apps attract a much broader demographic than many other genres like RPGs or strategy games, including older users and also people, again, who don't necessarily identify as gamers or game players. There were a couple of other categories that saw a lot of growth, particularly on the Google Play Store in March. So educational games saw a rise of almost 15.5% in downloads. And interestingly, RPGs also saw an almost 16% increase in installs as well. So this is just a more focused look at one of the board games, Scrabble, which was originally published by EA, and then it was recently acquired by Scopely and relaunched as Scrabble Go with quite a new aesthetic. So on the bottom right there, you can see the different home screens. So the one on the left is for the newly launched Scrabble Go, and the one on the right is for the original Scrabble. So you can see already that they look quite different. And feedback from some of the mature and more established players of the previous, more kind of traditional Scrabble app has been very negative, and there's been a bit of a backlash. But at the same time, new users are being acquired from younger generations. One of the effects of this pandemic is that traditional board games are becoming a much more important part of the kind of new digital age. And as with the kind of broader game spectrum, they provide a way to connect with people via a common interest. So this an increased interest around board game apps will flatten when the pandemic recedes. Many non-gamer users will ultimately leave the platform and return to physical games when they can. But there will definitely be a lasting effect, and a small percentage will remain engaged. And this is something that we're expecting to see across the board. So in this final segment, I'm going to explore the impact of previous recessions on the industry and just identify some of the lessons I think we can take from these scenarios. So gaming's lifespan as a commercial proposition is actually very brief compared to things like television and cinema, which have been around for almost a century. Games are also at the forefront of technological change in terms of many things, so device usage, distribution, virtual socializing, for example, and lots more. And this restlessness and also complexity means that fundamental changes are occurring all the time, almost continuously. And this makes it very difficult to isolate possible impacts of recessions. During 2008, which is a period I'm going to touch on briefly in the next couple of slides, digital delivery and also connectivity were only really beginning to be explored. And mobile was on the cusp of emerging as this kind of global superpower in gaming. And even now, things like VR, AR, and especially cloud intend to be really quite transformative to the games landscape. And I'm sure that in several years' time, the picture of the industry will be quite different to what it is today. So there have been pandemics during the lifespan of the games industry, things like SARS, Ebola, swine flu, but actually they've been quite well contained and their impact on developed regions was quite minimal. So COVID-19 is really the first pandemic to have such a hugely widespread impact. And this unprecedented nature of its consequences make it very difficult to compare with past recessions, or to look to past recessions as indicators of what might be to come. So the two scenarios I'm going to briefly cover in terms of their impact on the games market are the Great Recession in the USA in 2008 and also the Sendai earthquake recession in Japan in 2011. So here we have consumer spend on console content and services, both leading up to and after the Great Recession in the US in 2008. So this is just a plain view to give a clear idea of the broader picture. And significantly, there is the kind of cyclical nature of console generations to consider here. So Xbox 360 and PS3 launched in 2005, 2006. And that's where we really start to see the beginnings of this steep incline in spending. And then PS4 launched at the end of 2013. And that's really where we can see spend beginning to accelerate again. So while this sloping decline might look quite severe, there are actually several more secular trends that are driving this downturn rather than the recession. So the peak you can see in 2008 is actually exaggerated due to the popularity of games like Guitar Hero and Wii Fit, so peripheral-led games that were temporarily really popular and had very high average sale prices. They drove up average sale prices for the whole segment. But their popularity quickly faded. And also in 2010, this is around the time that mobile began to emerge as this really disruptive force in gaming. And this is also around the time that we saw the shift from feature phones to smartphones. So around this time, the long expected transition to digital from physical is also beginning to take hold. But implementation was very slow, and several large publishers were quite exposed from 2010 to 2015. And ultimately it ended up taking kind of several years for digital to start maturing and for it to really drive a fresh peak of spend. And here we have mobile games downloads and consumer spend, both leading up to and after the Sendai earthquake recession of 2011 in Japan. So again, this is the plain view, just to give a clear idea of the broader picture. You can see quite clearly there that although downloads continue to climb and appear unaffected, spend is very flat in 2012, which is the year following the earthquake, which heavily suggests evidence of a recessionary impact. So just to emphasize that, there is strong evidence of flattening spend seen in 2012, but the trend is otherwise very robust. 2012 is clearly very out of step with the general growth story that we see here. But there are also some other factors to bear in mind in terms of the wider picture. So Japan was always handheld centric in terms of console. And when you combine this with its advanced implementation of the device group for gaming, these growth curves are really not that surprising. Also, market maturity in 2016 meant that spend was still growing, even though downloads had leveled out by that point. Of course, now top games can persist at the top of the charts for many, many years, maintaining strong average revenues per user. Also, the concentration of high spending individuals in Japan perhaps exacerbates the recessionary impact here. So if spend per user was lower, but more evenly spread across the population, the effect perhaps would not have been quite so stark. So Japan has the highest spend per capita in the world. At the time of the recession, mobile was, of course, still very young. As the games platform, it wasn't well established, business models were still being defined, and users were still getting accustomed to mobile gaming. And this made it more vulnerable to economic shudders, I think. And so the recessionary impact that's shown here will almost certainly not be replicated in future scenarios. And of course, Japan is a very unique market, particularly in terms of mobile. So these are some key takeaways that I think are the most important points from this deck. Primarily the fundamental games market forces are more likely to steer consumer habits than recession. So growth and decline stories will vary considerably across territories. Strong growth in mobile-first markets will be balanced by more modest growth in the West, and the post-crisis recessionary decline will reflect this. Also, low-price entertainment products tend to be quite resilient during recession. And so we expect to see potential flattening of spend into the third and fourth quarters of this year, and perhaps into 2021 overall, but certainly not a heavy decline. Creators must capitalize on exposure to large audiences while dealing with internal challenges. So despite the internal difficulties that I'm sure so many people are facing, it's really crucial for companies to take advantage of the increased exposure afforded by this kind of event when there are so many people in lockdown. try to circumvent negative impact through being preemptive, responsive, and dynamic. So the industry pivot to digital has made the segment even more robust, and it's important to take advantage of this, as we saw with Pokemon Go. Prepare for increased traffic, but not necessarily increased spend. So a lot of the growth that we're seeing is partially due to an influx of non-gamers who are seeking and downloading free content. But they can be unfamiliar with monetization models and therefore not willing to spend. Finally, and most importantly, to reiterate, look primarily to fundamental games market forces when predicting recessionary impacts. So the games market is not entirely recession-proof. I think we definitely saw that during the Sendai earthquake recession in Japan. But internal factors do tend to hold broader sway than recession. And that's me. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you very much. Yeah, I love the fact that you keep saying the words fundamentally games. Oh, wait. Yes. Well, that's my company name.
Yeah, promoting you.
Yeah, exactly. But anyway, I think the key thing is there's so much good stuff in terms of looking at the data. I particularly like that case where you showed about how the 2008, you know, that actually the split was not necessarily a decline. It was actually the arrival of new you know, distribution methods becoming kind of more dominant.
Yeah, for sure.
At the same time as following a previous peak that was unrelated. So I think that's fascinating to see that. Now we're literally out of time, but I'm going to ask this particular question. We now have an increased demand for mobile games, but this tendency may decrease significantly with the end of the lockdown, is the hypothesis. Is it true that hard times have yet to come for indie developers? And if so, how long do you think that will last?
Can you just repeat the first part?
So there's been an increase in demand for mobile games, which potentially could be down to the lockdown.
Yes.
So afterwards, there may be a decline in that usage, and then that could potentially impact, in particular, indie game developers. Do you think that's likely, or do you think there's going to be a recession coming, essentially, for games?
Well, I think the games market is extremely resilient to recession, particularly as it tends to be made up of a lot of low cost, as I mentioned, kind of low cost entertainment items, I suppose, digital items. And I think that although we are definitely going to see a decline, especially in terms of downloads, because actually spend hasn't been hugely affected if we look at the broader picture. It's more in terms of heightened engagement and also an increase in downloads. So while that will come back down to earth, I suppose, we're definitely going to see a kind of small percentage of these users remaining because they've discovered the platform, they've discovered games that they enjoy, and they want to stick around. And I think games will probably have more staying power than other apps, things like relating to kind of food delivery or kind of that sort of stuff, because I think people will download them when they need them, and then, you know, they won't go back to them.
Games have an escape quality to them, and I think, you know, particularly in times of hardship, that is something that people reach to, and too often, sadly, it's alcohol. So you know, at least we're a relatively healthy outlet for that escape.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah, and I think that's kind of supported by what I said about governments and education bodies using games as ways to facilitate interaction between students or communities and things during this time.
And thank goodness we've seen a change of attitude from the WHO, who before COVID were talking about us being evil and like gambling. Anyway,
yeah.
Don't get me started. And now it's actually really healthy because it's a great way to connect to people. So let's hope that we get more balanced kind of views.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, for sure.
Louise, as always, thank you so much. And
thank you very much.
Be able to share all those slides with everybody as well.
Of course. Yeah. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Louise. Take care.